going down, APUSH peeps? We have chapter 7 for you from Give Me Liberty. This one matches up to the 4th edition, but don't worry if you have another one, it'll match up as well. And please check out the description for a bunch of additional videos related to this chapter, plus links to other resources at APUSHreview.com. All right, let's talk about America under the Confederation, or the Articles of Confederation. Very important to know, our first governing document of the United States. It created a very weak central government. There is this fear of too much power, most notably because of Great Britain. So if you had to summarize the Articles of Confederation in one word, it would be weak, as it applies to the central or national or federal government. There was a Congress under the Articles of Confederation, and it was a unicameral, which means a one-house legislature. Each state had one vote regardless of population, so very heavily populated Maryland would have the same amount of say as very teeny tiny Rhode Island. The national government had very few powers. Among the few powers they had were declaring war, foreign affairs, and making treaties with other countries as well. About 100,000 Indians lived in land that extended to the Mississippi River. So remember, at the end of the American Revolution, the U.S. gained all this land east of the Mississippi River, and there were about 100,000 natives living in this area over here. Settling land became an important source of revenue under the Articles because the federal government could not tax citizens under the Articles of Confederation, and they would basically say to states, hey, can you help us out by giving us some tax money? And states would be like, yeah, okay, buddy, it's in the mail. Yeah, you'll see it real soon. Settlers often paid little attention to land belonging to natives, and this would lead to lots of land disputes with natives. And land disputes among Americans would also happen because people would settle there so quickly before the land could be properly surveyed. And this was especially true in what would become Kentucky. Okay, land ordinances. There are 3 of them here. You have to know them. Very, very important. Mentioned in the new curriculum. First one, 1784. This established self-government. 1785 is very important. This sold land in the Old Northwest. And the 16 square mile of a section would provide money for education. So pretend this is 6 by 6 square miles. And each square mile section here would be sold off, and this would make up a township. Now the 16th section right here in red, money from this section would be provided to help out education. So there would be a push to educate Americans in the Old Northwest as part of selling this off. In the Northwest Land Ordinance of 1787, this one from 2 years later, this eventually was carved into 5 states. You have Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and then a teeny tiny bit of Minnesota. Once a territory reached 60,000 people, this is not in the textbook, but it's important to know, it could apply to become a state. So this established a process to increase the size of America, and it also allowed the new territories to eventually have equal footing with other states. Most importantly, probably, is the fact that slavery was prohibited in all of the Northwest Territory. So all this area up here in black, that's the Northwest Territory, slavery was prohibited. There was the first congressional ban of slavery in the United States history. Now, Confederation's weaknesses, we talked about them. Couldn't tax, the federal government could tax, and it was very, very weak. Americans were barred from trading with the West Indies under this new government after the American Revolution because Britain was very upset with the United States. And states also contributed to many economic issues. They did things like impose tariffs. Each state would impose different tariffs on foreign goods. They would print their own money, which would lead to varying values and inflation. And they really discouraged trading between the states. Shays Rebellion. Holy cow, you got to know this bad boy. Very, very important. So this is in 1786, 1787 in Massachusetts. It's a rebellion of farmers led by a dude by the name of Daniel Shays. He was a former Revolutionary War veteran. Now, they were protesting farm foreclosures, and they attacked courthouses in Massachusetts to try to stop the farm foreclosures. And they would use similar tactics to protests of the 1760s and 1770s. So they really saw themselves as being patriotic and really carrying on the same spirit of protest from just a decade or two earlier. And this rebellion helped to demonstrate to many individuals that a stronger national government was needed. This lasted several months, in part because there was not a national military to put it down. And you could go and see the final battle here of Shays' Rebellion from February of 1787. So this lasts a long time, and many people are like, you know what, this is crazy. Maybe we need a stronger government with a more sound economic policy and a national military. Enter James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. They begin to argue for a stronger government. And there's this convention held in Annapolis, Maryland called the Annapolis Convention. Now, the meeting was to discuss economic issues. And basically they agree, you know what, we're going to meet 1 year later in Philadelphia to try to amend the Articles of Confederation. But this is going to turn into the Constitutional Convention, because in order to amend the Articles of Confederation, all 13 states had to agree. So it was next to impossible to amend them. So they pretty much scrapped the whole thing and they pump out the Constitution. So it's important to know that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were not at the convention. Now, Thomas Jefferson, yes, he did write. He was the main writer of the Declaration of Independence, but he was not at the Constitutional Convention. He was living life up in Europe, enjoying it as a diplomat. Most of the 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention were very wealthy. They were from the upper class, and they were educated as well, many of them. So the Constitution establishes 3 branches of government: the executive, legislative, and judicial. And there are many debates at the convention, most notably over slavery and representation, but we'll focus on representation first. So we have the Virginia Plan, which is proposed by James Madison, and he proposes a bicameral legislature or a 2-house legislature based on population. So the more population a state has, the more representation they would get. Now, small states like New Jersey, they didn't like this. So they proposed a unicameral or 1-house legislature with equal representation. This was pretty much the same idea under the Articles of Confederation. So we have an impasse, and Roger Sherman from Connecticut proposes what becomes known as the Great Compromise. This creates a bicameral, again, 2-house legislature with 1 house with equal representation. That's the Senate, and 1 based on population. That's the House of Representatives. And here's the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. You can go get a free tour. It's really cool. It's about an hour long. You get to see the inner workings of Congress. I highly recommend you check it out if you are in D.C. Now, it's important to note that under the Constitution, the original Constitution, senators were originally elected by state legislatures, not the people. It's not till the 1900s with the 17th Amendment that people get to elect their senator. Voting rules were left to the states under the Constitution, and this would lead to issues such as poll taxes, literacy tests, etc. after the Civil War, and that was a major issue of the civil rights movement, was more access to voting for minorities. The Electoral College elected the president, not the people. And there's a really cool video in the description. It's not that by a guy by the name of C.G.P. Gray. He does a great job of explaining the Electoral College in 4 minutes. If you want more info, check it out. The runner-up in a presidential election under the original Constitution would become the vice president. Now, this changes with the 12th Amendment, but so imagine with the 2012 election, Barack Obama becomes president, and Mitt Romney becomes his vice president. That's how it was under the original Constitution. And the executive and judicial branches reflected fears of allowing citizens to have too much say in government. What I mean by that is, if you look at the executive branch, it's not the people that vote for the president, it's the Electoral College. And the judicial branch, they are appointed by the president, judges are. Okay, slavery was a very hotly debated topic as well, as I mentioned. And the Fugitive Slave Clause stated that slaves would remain slaves even if they escaped to a free state. So changing their location within the country does not change their status as a slave. The national government could not interfere with slavery in the states, and this ultimately will be resolved by the Civil War and with amendments to the Constitution. Most early presidents owned slaves, people like Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Jackson, etc. Many of them did. And Ben Franklin played a key role in persuading many of the 55 delegates, or 45 that were left, to ratify the document. Here is Ben Franklin right in the middle. And I would love to know, what is Alexander Hamilton whispering in his ear, huh? Can you imagine? And the national economy was strengthened due to congressional powers given to the national government under the Articles. They had control, the Congress had control over interstate trade, tariffs, coining money, etc. We're going to come back to interstate trade in future chapters. Wicked important idea of who should control that, and that's the federal government. All right, the Federalists, also known as the Federalist Papers. These were 85 essays written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and the first Chief Justice of the United States, John Jay, and they urged ratification or approval of the Constitution. Now, Hamilton argued that the Constitution protected individual liberties and that it did not limit them. Many people were afraid that the Constitution was too strong and did not adequately protect individual liberties or freedoms. So Madison's going to write Federalist 10 and 51, and I have a video in the description below, and he's going to argue for separation of powers and the benefits of a large republic. And he said actually the size of America is a really good thing. The bigger it is, the harder it will be for the government to kind of abuse its power. And he also talks about factions or groups and controlling or limiting the power of them. He also argued the more diverse the country became, the more liberties people had because there's such a wide range of beliefs and ideas. The Anti-Federalists included key people like Samuel Adams and this dude, Patrick Henry. They were very weary of a strong central government, most notably because there wasn't a Bill of Rights. So Madison says, you know what? I promise if we ratify this Constitution, we'll add a Bill of Rights right after, which does happen. Now, it's very important to note the reason the Bill of Rights were added was to gain the support of the Anti-Federalists to get them to pass or ratify the Constitution. So Bill of Rights, state constitutions had their own Bill of Rights. Some amendments from the Constitution's Bill of Rights include the First Amendment, which include freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, and petition. The Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. Fourth Amendment states that a warrant is needed to search a home. Fifth Amendment, no double jeopardy, means you can't be charged for the same crime twice. You also can't be forced to testify against oneself. Now, the Ninth Amendment is interesting because it says, hey, just because a right isn't listed here doesn't mean you can violate it or take it away. And the 10th Amendment establishes what's known as federalism, or powers that are given to states. Things like education, licensing professionals, etc. There are certain things that are only state powers, and that's given to states under the 10th Amendment. Now, until the 20th century, you'll talk about this a lot more when you take AP Gov, but the Bill of Rights, really until the 1900s, the Bill of Rights only applied to the federal government. It did not apply to state government. So these were only protections from the federal government, not necessarily the state governments. And there was no mention of God in the Constitution whatsoever. So it's really a secular document. Right, the preamble of the Constitution references liberty and posterity, which would later be echoed by Lincoln in the Civil War and his famous Gettysburg Address. So we'll come back to those ideas in several chapters from now. Indians were not considered Americans, and there was no mention of slavery in the Constitution. Slaves were referred to as other persons. Indians saw their life affected as a result because of westward expansion led to debates over the treatment of Indians. Treaties often had the support of only a small portion of the tribe, yet every tribe member had to abide or follow by the treaty. Little Turtle, he was the leader of the Miami Confederacy in Ohio. He defeated the Americans in the Northwest Territory, but he and his followers were eventually defeated at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and they were forced to sign the Treaty of Grenville, in which they ceded or gave up a significant amount of land in the Ohio Territory, in the Northwest Territory, in present-day Ohio and Indiana. So natives are going to continue to be pushed further and further west. Now, Jefferson will argue that natives could become members of American society if they would do things like focus on farming and abandon hunting. In other words, to do things that Americans did. And this will be a push even 100 years later. In 1887, we'll learn about a famous act called the Dawes Act, which tried to Americanize Native Americans or have them act American. Indians would be considered civilized by many people when they would adopt American ways and gender roles. Again, focus on things like farming and abandoning hunting. And many natives, this will be a theme throughout American history, will try to preserve their autonomy or their self-rule or independence. Not until the 14th Amendment in the mid-19th century was citizenship defined in the Constitution. And the 14th Amendment says if you're born in America, you are a U.S. citizen. Some free blacks had rights in the United States during this time, especially the right to vote, depending on where they were. Letters from an American Farmer was written by Hector Saint Jean de Crevecoeur. How was that for a French accent? And he wrote that American culture was similar to a melting pot. This idea of the melting pot that we know so well really was advocated by this dude way back in the late 18th century. Throughout most of the 19th century, the U.S. had a policy of open, unrestricted immigration. We'll see it with Germans, we'll see it with Irish, we'll see it really throughout most of the 18th century until we get to about the 1880s. We'll come back to that in future chapters. Unfortunately, many Americans viewed blacks as intellectually inferior to whites, and Jefferson viewed natives as nearly equal intellectually. And this is the idea of the term noble savages, the idea that Native Americans could be quote-unquote civilized. He envisioned natives becoming a part of American society, but he did not, under any circumstances, favor intermarriages with them. Jefferson and others believed that if slavery ended, they could not remain in America slaves. So organizations like the American Colonization Society will gain prominence, and this movement sought to move free blacks to Africa, and this is a form of gradual emancipation. Now, Liberia, located right here, this is where thousands of slaves were shipped, former slaves were shipped from America to Africa after they were freed. Racism was increasingly used to justify slavery and the harsh treatment of African Americans. This is in spite of a country built on freedom, and you'll see in the next couple chapters as we progress, stereotypes and racism will be used more and more to justify the harsh treatment of African Americans and slaves. Okay, let's do a quick recap. Be able to identify and explain the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, the land ordinances, especially the one of 1787, what did it ban in the Northwest Territory, Shays Rebellion, what were the causes of it, and what was the impact of it, Virginia Plan and New Jersey plans, know both of them, and then know the Great Compromise as well, which still disputes between that. The Federalist Papers and the Bill of Rights. What was the purpose of the Federalist Papers, and why were the Bill of Rights eventually added to the Constitution? Treaty of Grenville, how did that affect Native Americans? And what were different justifications for slavery and the treatment of slaves? All right, guys, look forward to see you right back here for Chapter 8. I hope you enjoyed Chapter 7. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I thank you guys for watching, and have a good day.